As the home state for the first presidential primary, New Hampshire plays an oversized role in shaping perceptions of national politics. Then again, that also goes for coverage by mainstream news organizations. That's why a team of reporters from the Boston Institute for Nonprofit Journalism, or BINJ, went north to a pop-up newsroom avoiding hotels infested with talking points. To tell us about the results and what it takes to make them possible are the Institute's founder, Chris Faraone, and from the team of reporters, Dan McCarthy. Thank you both for being with us.
Thank you.
Dan, I want to ask you, you're from New Hampshire, at least for some past part of your life. What was different up here this year?
You know, this year, as opposed to cycles past, particularly obviously the circuits of the 2016 run, and even through the Obama years, there seemed to be just a missing moxie from the electorate. You know, at most of the actual campaign stops we were going to, a lot of times I tried to, you know, like everybody trying to get commentary from the actual local electorate. And almost every time it was some kind of shipped-in stooge for one of the campaigns, all zealous in their support, but you know they would only be able to speculate on issues facing New Hampshire as it related to talking points they'd memorized for whatever horse they were backing in the race.
Chris, based on what Dan said, you really wanted to avoid the national boilerplate. So what was your strategy for that?
Yeah, there's something that we use called the Citizens Agenda. It's kind of a journalism geeky thing, but it was developed by the Poynter Institute, big journalism institute in Florida, after the '88 election. Which is hilarious to think that to them it was the '88 election. It was all it was all talking points and no substance, no issues. But long story short, it's simple. We put out a survey that said, what do you want the candidates to be talking about as they compete for votes? We did that digitally. We did that in real life. We even went up a couple weeks early and left signs and flyers at bars in New Hampshire. And at the in total, we got about 200 pieces of feedback. We took that and we synthesized it into a list of about 20 items. And this is what people really wanted to hear about. Some of them were the things you might imagine, healthcare, but also there were specific questions within there. The opioid problem, sure, but more specifically, recovery drugs, Suboxone. These are not just generic topics we're able to kind of dig in. And that gave our reporters a nice field guide to go out there with.
Dan, how did that play into your head when you were going out to cover the campaigns?
It would be one of two ways. First and foremost, aside from maybe what some of the optics in a colorful newsroom would look like, it was actually a pretty well-oiled organization. There was a lot of structure to it to be able to maximize how we were covering it. So going out into the field, if somebody, say, was going to cover, an Andrew Yang event or a Bernie Sanders event, it was making sure to go there to not only capture as much as the voice of the electorate, but also then focus on certain key issues. So as we'd go down that citizen agenda, of course, there'd be certain ones that were the obvious questions for a particular candidate. Other ones would be, questions that obviously the citizens wanted to hear about, but maybe that particular candidate or that particular candidate's camp and supporters weren't used to actually being put on the spot about and thinking about what that policy could be. And more importantly, how that differentiated that candidate from somebody else.
Chris, one of the things that intrigued me, you had one reporter go out to where people bring their recyclables on a Saturday morning.
Yeah.
What did you take away from that?
That was actually, it's interesting, not to rag on Mayor Pete Buttigieg, but it was not easy to find Buttigieg supporters in the wild, if you will. It was certainly not easy to find young ones. We had heard that a bunch of Buttigieg supporters are going to be at the town dump. Dan's from New Hampshire, he knows that's a place where where a lot of people do campaign, because on the weekends in municipalities or townships where there is no recycling and door to door like we have here in Boston, that's where everybody goes. So it's if you want to see everybody in a town, or a good portion of them, that's where you'll go. But I just want to say one example of a story that we were able to ask that really put some of the campaigns in a position where they had to answer a question that they wouldn't have otherwise had to answer is about the gig economy. They all have their economic platforms, but a lot of our people who wrote into us wanted to know, they work for Uber, they work for Lyft, they have these basically temp jobs, and it's something that frankly even the more progressive camps were not didn't really have great answers for. They kind of pointed to unionization, but it's really a separate issue. So, that's really, I think that's a great example of how we were able to go in with kind of a unique angle.
This has been News. We're talking with Chris Faraone and Dan McCarthy from the Boston Institute of Nonprofit Journalism. Dan, of course, part of the strategy here, too, was to avoid those fancy hotels where the national people hang out and keep repeating each other. Where did you go, and tell us what it was like?
So for the second cycle of New Hampshire primaries in a row, we were at the Shaskeen Irish Pub and Restaurant in downtown Manchester on Elm Street, right across from City Hall, through their very gracious crew of owners and staff. They once again took us in, let us set up camp as this mobile but tangible newsroom set up in the front of a bar with all of the ephemera and bric-a-brac we pick up along the campaign trail, which sometimes includes fringe candidates coming in, trying to do quick spot interviews with this sort of guerrilla news team. Others were spotlighted by either some of the hairdos coming in from the mainstream press, right the way through Vermin Supreme and his ponies and his sort of traveling minstrel show. But at the core of it, we connected with this bar to say, look, this is a way to capture that lightning in a bottle that every 4 years becomes part of the tapestry of the national history of election politics.
Chris, you spent a little time in a different milieu. You saw a whiz kid from the Washington Post and a shock jock, an older shock jock from Boston, watching Bernie Sanders, and you found out maybe they have something in common.
Blew me away. It was the one time I snuck out of our alternative newsroom, went over to where all the bigs are, and there I was sitting next to two people, a young Washington Post reporter and an older, not shock jock so much, conservative talk show host. And the debate was on. It was Friday night, the St. Anselm debate, and they really they had a lot to agree on. But also, there's a lot of talking points. Just being in that, I think you said infested with talking points, that environment, just hearing, the radio host was still talking about Elizabeth Warren's, Native American debacle, if you will, or quagmire. But these are just things that we didn't care about. So it was really always interesting when you go out and it's interesting. Talk about an echo chamber, Radio Row, and these things. They call it Radio Row, where there's literally dozens of radio commentators and surrogates for the candidates walking up and down trying to get spots on these shows like it's 42nd Street. That's not what we were about. I didn't care about that stuff. We didn't do stories on Bernie Bros or who raised more money that week or imaginary Klobuchar surges. We went out there, and it's cliche almost to say we reported on the issues, but it's exactly what we did. We ended up producing about 40 stories, and sure, some of them were comparing just scenes, and that stuff's important too. But I'd say a good 25 of those stories, you won't see anything like them anywhere else.
Dan, one widespread impression from New Hampshire was that Warren went down, Klobuchar went up, and everything else was more or less as expected. But what would you tell people was the main lesson from this?
I think the main lesson from this is that the fiefdoms that have been created with the Democratic establishment and all of its typical mouthpieces, really trying to set or reset the narrative. You're starting to see some of the echoes of 2016 for the same people who didn't call things right in 2016. This time around, you're starting to see some of those similar sort of siloed off framings of who's supposed to advance and why, who is that presumptive nominee that can definitely take on Trump. But more than anything, people are still, at this point at least, voting with their wallet, not their principles. There's a lot of people that I talked to on the campaign trail of the New Hampshire electorate that I talked to that aside from what their pontifications were on Sanders versus Mayor Pete, it was a surprising amount were actually talking about waiting for Bloomberg to get into the race. And especially in the southern part of the state, there was a lot of people that are sort of waiting for his impact because they either see it's Tom Steyer with 10 times the resume or somebody that has the money, the resources, and that moderate push that could potentially take on Trump. And as we saw in Dixville Notch, of the 7 or 9 people up there, one vote went to Bloomberg, but he got written in as a Republican. So that draw looks like there's a microcosm there.
Chris, what do you think the mainstream missed up there?
I mean, for me, it was just that this really is one of the most despicable cycles as far as the chatter among the talking heads. It is unbelievable. I mean, and the story changes like every 5 minutes. When we went up there, I think there was talk of people were saying and out of Iowa that it was if Joe Biden, they're going to impeach Joe Biden if he gets in. I'm thinking like, this guy's not even in fourth place. What did he end up in?
On his third run.
Right, and it was so. And the other takeaway was really, the Sanders support is undeniable. We sent somebody the night of the pre-primary night. That's when Biden was still there. He left the day of the primary, but he had 150 people at his pre-primary event, and Bernie Sanders packed an arena with a rock and roll concert and all sorts of things. So I think that. I'd be the first really to be yelling hey, everybody, all fellow progressives, stop exaggerating about the Bernie blackout and everything. But when you're up there and you're seeing everyone kind of spinning their wheels trying to figure out how to bury this guy, it really is interesting to see it up close, because if they're seeing what I saw, it was this unbelievable, tremendous groundswell of support. And another thing is, and our reporter, Mark Gruder, a friend of ours, brought this up, is class is a big issue here. And you're seeing that's finally spoken about a little bit now. But one thing we saw was, for example, Londonderry, where Dan grew up, it's a wealthier, is that considered a suburb of Manchester? Or?
No, it's, if anything, a suburb probably of Boston, with the amount of commuters that actually live up there for the lower taxes and the more, at the time, more affordable housing in the burbs and commuting down the city. It's an upper middle class.
And those places went for Pete Buttigieg.
Yeah.
I think, 23 of the 25 wealthiest communities in New Hampshire. So, but really it was also that, people want to know about a lot of other stuff besides, who raised the most money. They don't care about that. Voters just don't. They may play the horse race game when they're sitting with their friends at a bar, but ultimately there are actual issues like healthcare that people actually give a darn about.
Chris, we should also mention you've got some things you're working on around the Boston area, and you're also trying to raise a little money too, right?
Yeah, well, we're a nonprofit, so I always say if we raise $2,000 or do $2,000 worth of journalism, last year we happened to raise $200,000. We're very fortunate. Right now, our big issues are, we're looking at a lot of police issues, continuing at the state and the city level. Also doing a lot on housing, really looking at who are the owners of a lot of these properties. A lot of them are ghost owners. A lot of them trace to P.O. boxes. So we also have some cool new tools that will be rolling out so people can see visualizations of the reporting that we're doing.
And of course you got a website where people can check things out.
BINJonline.org, or if you want to make a shortcut and make a donation, it's give to BINJ, BINJ.org. Either one works.
Right, thank you both very much. Chris Faraone and Dan McCarthy.
Thanks much.
In a moment, a new report on racial integration in schools, potential for progress and signs of resistance.